I used to believe that love was the one thing in this world that couldn't lie to you. I thought that when you gave your heart to someone, when you trusted them with the most vulnerable parts of yourself, they would protect you the same way you protected them. I was wrong. I was so completely, devastatingly wrong. And by the time I realized it, the man I had loved for 7 years had already stolen everything from me: my savings, my home, my reputation, my sense of self. He had dismantled my entire life with surgical precision, and he had done it all while sleeping beside me every night, kissing me goodbye every morning, telling me he loved me with the same lips that whispered lies into another woman's ear. My name is Sophie Mitchell, and this is the story of how my ex-husband became my worst enemy and how I made him pay for every single thing he did to me. I met Daniel Carter in the spring of 2016. I was 25 years old, working as a junior accountant at a mid-sized firm in central London, and I had just come out of a painful breakup that had left me questioning whether I even knew how to choose the right person. My friends told me I needed to get out more, to stop hiding behind spreadsheets and late nights at the office. So when my colleague invited me to a networking event for tech startups in Shoreditch, I forced myself to go. Daniel was the first person I noticed when I walked into that converted warehouse space. He was tall, almost 6'2", with dark hair that fell across his forehead in a way that looked both careless and deliberate. He had this smile, this warm, open smile that made you feel like you were the only person in the room. He was standing near the bar, surrounded by a small group of people who were hanging on his every word, and when his eyes met mine across the crowded space, I felt something shift inside my chest. He made his way over to me within minutes, introduced himself with a handshake that was firm but not aggressive, confident but not arrogant. He told me he was the founder of a fintech startup called Meridian Solutions, that they were developing software to help small businesses manage their finances more efficiently, and that he had studied computer science at Cambridge before deciding that academia wasn't for him. I was impressed. Of course I was impressed. He was intelligent, successful, passionate about his work, and he seemed genuinely interested in what I had to say. He asked me questions about my job, about my background, about my opinions on everything from cryptocurrency to climate change. He listened when I spoke, really listened, in a way that made me feel seen for the first time in years. We exchanged numbers that night, and by the following weekend, we were on our first official date. Dinner at a small Italian restaurant in Covent Garden, followed by a walk along the South Bank as the city lights reflected off the Thames. He held my hand as we walked, and when he kissed me goodnight outside my flat in Clapham, I remember thinking that this might actually be it. This might be the person I had been waiting for my entire life. The first year of our relationship was everything I had ever dreamed of. Daniel was attentive, romantic, supportive. He remembered the little things like how I took my coffee and which flowers were my favorites. He showed up at my office with lunch when I was working late, planned surprise weekend getaways to the Cotswolds, introduced me to his friends and family as though he was proud to have me by his side. His mother, Margaret, welcomed me with open arms. His father had passed away when Daniel was a teenager, and Margaret had raised him and his younger sister, Claire, on her own. She told me how grateful she was that Daniel had found someone like me, someone grounded and sensible who could balance out his more impulsive tendencies. I took that as a compliment at the time. I didn't realize she was trying to warn me. By the end of our first year together, Daniel asked me to move in with him. He had just purchased a beautiful 2-bedroom flat in Battersea, close to the park, with huge windows that let in the morning light and a balcony overlooking the river. I said yes without hesitation. I packed up my small rented room and merged my life with his, piece by piece, until I couldn't remember what it had felt like to exist separately. Looking back now, I can see the warning signs that I missed, the way he would sometimes disappear for hours without explanation, claiming he was in meetings or dealing with investor calls, the way his phone was always face down on the table, and how he would angle the screen away from me when he was texting. The way he could switch from warm and loving to cold and distant in the space of a single conversation, leaving me confused and desperate to understand what I had done wrong. But I explained it all away. I told myself that he was under pressure, that running a startup was stressful, that I needed to be patient and understanding. I told myself that my insecurities were the problem, that I was sabotaging a good thing by looking for trouble where there was none. And Daniel knew exactly how to keep me in that state of confused compliance. Whenever I questioned him, whenever I expressed doubt or concern, he would turn it back on me. He would tell me I was being paranoid, that I was letting my past relationship trauma affect my judgment, that if I truly loved him, I would trust him. He called it communication. I later learned the real word for it: gaslighting. We got engaged after 2 years together. Daniel proposed on a rainy evening in Paris, down on one knee beside the Seine, with a diamond ring that must have cost a small fortune. I cried happy tears, threw my arms around him, and said yes before he had even finished the question. I called my parents that night, called my best friend Bex, shared the news on social media, and watched the congratulations pour in from everyone who knew us. The wedding took place a year later, in the summer of 2019. A beautiful ceremony at a country estate in Surrey, followed by a reception under a marquee strung with fairy lights. My father walked me down the aisle with tears in his eyes, and I remember looking at Daniel as I approached him, thinking that I was the luckiest woman in the world. 140 guests watched us exchange vows. We promised to love each other in sickness and in health, for richer or for poorer, for better or for worse. We promised to honor and cherish each other until death parted us. Daniel looked me straight in the eyes as he made those promises, and his voice didn't waver once. He was lying, of course. He had been lying since the very beginning, but I wouldn't discover the full extent of his deception for another 3 years. The first crack appeared about 6 months after our wedding. Daniel came home late one evening, later than usual, and when I asked him where he had been, he snapped at me in a way he never had before. Told me I was suffocating him, that he needed space, that not everything in his life had to revolve around me. I apologized, even though I wasn't sure what I was apologizing for, and he softened almost immediately, pulled me into his arms, kissed my forehead, told me he was sorry, that work had been difficult, that he didn't mean to take it out on me, but it kept happening. The late nights became more frequent. The excuses became flimsier, and sometimes when he came home, I could smell something on him, a different perfume, a hint of cigarette smoke, even though Daniel didn't smoke. I tried to bring it up once, and he accused me of being paranoid, of trying to start fights, of not appreciating how hard he was working to build a future for us. The gaslighting intensified. I started to question my own perception of reality. When I was certain I had seen a text from someone called V on his phone, he told me I must have imagined it, that there was no one by that name in his contacts. When I found a receipt for a hotel in his jacket pocket, he explained it was for a client meeting and made me feel foolish for even asking. When I woke up at 3 a.m. to find him gone from our bed, he said he had just stepped out for fresh air, and I learned to stop questioning. The financial manipulation started around the same time, though I didn't recognize it for what it was. Daniel suggested that we combine our finances, arguing that it made sense for a married couple to have shared accounts. I was earning good money by then, having been promoted to senior accountant, and I agreed because it seemed like a natural step. He handled all the bills, all the investments, all the major financial decisions. He told me it was easier that way, that he was better with money than I was, and I believed him because I wanted to believe him. What I didn't know was that he was siphoning funds into accounts I didn't have access to. He was taking my salary and funneling portions of it into offshore holdings, into cryptocurrency wallets, into investment vehicles that existed only on paper. He was using my name to take out credit cards and loans that I never saw, running up debts that would eventually become my responsibility. He was building a shadow financial empire behind my back, and I was funding it with every pound I earned. By the spring of 2021, our marriage existed in name only. Daniel was rarely home, and when he was, he barely looked at me. The warmth that had once defined our relationship had been replaced by cold indifference, punctuated by occasional bursts of affection that kept me just hopeful enough to stay. I told myself that all marriages went through difficult phases, that we just needed to work through it, that the man I had fallen in love with was still in there somewhere, And then I found the evidence I couldn't explain away. It was a Tuesday afternoon in late April. I had come home early from work with a migraine, planning to take some painkillers and lie down in a dark room. Daniel wasn't supposed to be home until evening, but when I walked through the door, I heard voices coming from our bedroom. A woman's laugh, light and musical, and then Daniel's voice, low and intimate, saying words I couldn't quite make out. I should have stormed in there. I should have confronted them on the spot, but something held me back. Some instinct for self-preservation that I didn't even know I possessed. Instead, I crept back out of the flat as quietly as I had entered, sat in my car in the underground parking garage, and waited. 45 minutes later, I watched a woman emerge from the building. She was younger than me, maybe late 20s, with long, dark hair and the kind of effortless beauty that makes other women feel invisible. She walked with the confidence of someone who believed she was untouchable, and when she climbed into a sleek black car waiting at the curb, she was smiling. I sat there for what felt like hours, my mind racing through every possible explanation. Maybe she was a colleague, maybe they were working on a project together, maybe there was some perfectly innocent reason why a beautiful woman had been alone with my husband in our bedroom on a random Tuesday afternoon, but I knew. Deep down, in the part of myself that I had been silencing for years, I knew the truth. That night, I said nothing. Daniel came home at his usual time, kissed me on the cheek, asked about my day, as though nothing had happened. I played along, watching him carefully for any sign of guilt or discomfort. There was none. He was the same charming, attentive husband he had always pretended to be, and his performance was flawless. I realized then that I had been married to a stranger. The Daniel I thought I knew, the Daniel I had trusted with my heart and my future, didn't exist. He was a character in a story that Daniel had written for my benefit, a story designed to keep me compliant and controlled while he lived his real life in the shadows. But I also realized something else, something that changed everything. If Daniel could play this game, so could I. The next few weeks were the most difficult of my life. I had to pretend that nothing had changed, that I was still the trusting, devoted wife who believed every word her husband said. I had to smile when he kissed me, laugh at his jokes, make love to him while knowing that he had probably been with another woman just hours before. Every moment was an exercise in self-control, and every night I lay awake beside him, staring at the ceiling, planning my next move. I started with the finances. As an accountant, I knew how to read the signs of fraud and manipulation, and now that I was looking for them, they were everywhere. The joint accounts that always seemed to have less money than they should. The credit card statements that arrived with charges I didn't recognize. The investment portfolio that Daniel managed, which had somehow lost value even as the market soared. I began making copies of everything: bank statements, tax returns, property documents, emails, text messages that I managed to glimpse when Daniel left his phone unattended. I stored them in a folder on a cloud drive that Daniel didn't know existed, protected by a password he would never guess. I was building a case, piece by piece, and I was determined to make it airtight. But I needed help. I needed someone who could dig deeper than I could, someone who could uncover the full extent of Daniel's deception without alerting him to what I was doing. That's when I contacted Marcus Webb. Marcus was a private investigator who had been recommended to me by a colleague at work. She had used him during her own divorce, and she told me he was thorough, discreet, and completely trustworthy. I met him at a coffee shop in Brixton on a Saturday morning while Daniel thought I was at a yoga class, and I told him everything. He listened without judgment, took notes, asked pointed questions about Daniel's habits and routines. When I finished, he looked at me with a kind of quiet sympathy that almost made me cry. "I can help you," he said, "but I need you to understand that what we find might be worse than what you're expecting. Are you prepared for that?" I thought about all the lies I had already uncovered, all the betrayals I had already suspected. I thought about the woman I had seen leaving our building and the perfume I could still smell on Daniel's clothes. I thought about the money that had disappeared, the gaslighting that had made me question my own sanity, the years of my life I had wasted on a man who had never loved me. "Yes," I told him, "I'm prepared." Over the next 2 months, Marcus compiled a dossier on my husband that would have been devastating if I hadn't already accepted the reality of who Daniel was. The woman I had seen was Vanessa Price, a project manager at Meridian Solutions. Their affair had been going on for nearly 4 years, predating our engagement and our wedding. Daniel had set her up in a flat in Chelsea that he paid for with money from our joint accounts, and he visited her several times a week, sometimes staying overnight when he told me he was traveling for business. But the affair was only the beginning. Marcus discovered that Meridian Solutions was not the thriving startup Daniel had always claimed it to be. The company was deeply in debt, kept afloat only by a constant influx of investor money that Daniel obtained through a combination of exaggerated projections and outright lies. He had been cooking the books for years, hiding losses, fabricating clients, creating phantom revenue streams that existed only in his presentations to potential backers, and he had been using me to help him do it. My name was on several of the company's financial documents. Daniel had forged my signature on loan applications, on investment agreements, on contracts that tied me to liabilities I had never agreed to. If Meridian collapsed, and it was clear that collapse was imminent, I would be left holding a significant portion of the debt. My credit would be destroyed. My professional reputation would be in ruins. And Daniel would walk away with the money he had hidden, leaving me to face the consequences alone. When Marcus showed me the evidence, I felt something inside me shift. The sadness and confusion that had defined the past few months crystallized into something harder, something sharper. It was anger, pure and cold and clarifying. Daniel had not just betrayed me, he had weaponized our relationship, turned our marriage into a tool for his own enrichment, and he had done it with a smile on his face. He had looked me in the eyes every single day and lied to me, knowing that he was systematically destroying my life. I decided then that I would not be his victim. I would not crawl away in defeat, lick my wounds, and try to rebuild from the ashes he had left behind. I would make him pay. I would expose every lie, every scheme, every betrayal, and I would watch as everything he had built came crashing down around him. The revenge had begun. The first step was protecting myself legally. I hired a solicitor named Francis Chen, who specialized in complex financial disputes and had experience with cases involving fraud and asset concealment. I told her everything, showed her everything, and she laid out my options with clear-eyed pragmatism. "Your husband has committed multiple offenses," she explained. "Forgery, fraud, identity theft, and potentially money laundering, depending on where those hidden funds came from. But prosecuting him is complicated. Some of these activities took place over years, some of them cross international borders, and proving your lack of involvement will require careful documentation." I told her I had the documentation. I showed her the files I had been collecting, the records Marcus had obtained, the timeline I had constructed of Daniel's deceptions. Her eyebrows rose as she reviewed the materials, and when she looked up at me, there was something like respect in her expression. "You've done excellent work," she said. "This gives us a strong foundation, but I need to warn you that the process will be slow. Daniel has resources, connections, and he's clearly experienced at hiding the truth. He will fight back." "I know," I said. "I'm counting on it." The next few months were a delicate balance of gathering evidence and maintaining appearances. Daniel had no idea what I was planning. As far as he knew, I was still his oblivious wife, too trusting and too in love to see what was happening right under my nose. I used that assumption to my advantage, continuing to ask innocent questions about the business, expressing support for his long hours and frequent travels, playing the part of the devoted spouse, even as I cataloged every new piece of evidence that would eventually destroy him. Marcus continued his surveillance, tracking Daniel's movements, documenting his meetings with Vanessa, photographing the expensive gifts he bought her with money that should have been ours. He also dug deeper into the financial maze Daniel had created, working with a forensic accountant to trace the funds that had disappeared from our accounts and the debts that had been incurred in my name. The picture that emerged was staggering. Daniel had hidden over £800,000 in offshore accounts across 3 different jurisdictions. He had taken out loans totaling nearly £300,000 using my identity, spreading them across multiple lenders to avoid detection. He had used company funds to finance his affair, his lifestyle, and what appeared to be a plan to abandon everything and start fresh somewhere else, probably with Vanessa by his side. He was planning to leave me. He was planning to leave me bankrupt, discredited, and alone, while he escaped to some tropical paradise with another woman and all the money he had stolen. But he had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated me. The confrontation came in October of 2022. I had spent months preparing for this moment, rehearsing what I would say, anticipating how Daniel would respond. But when the time finally arrived, I felt surprisingly calm. The anger that had fueled me was still there, but it had been tempered by purpose, refined into something cold and controlled. I waited until a Friday evening, when Daniel was relaxed and unsuspecting. He had come home earlier than usual, poured himself a glass of wine, and settled onto the sofa with his phone in hand, probably texting Vanessa, arranging their next rendezvous. The thought no longer hurt me. It only strengthened my resolve. I sat down across from him, a folder of documents in my hands. He glanced up at me with mild curiosity, then returned his attention to his phone. "We need to talk," I said. "About what?" he asked, still not really looking at me. "About Vanessa, about the money, about everything." That got his attention. His head snapped up, and for just a moment I saw something flicker behind his eyes. Fear. It was gone almost immediately, replaced by the smooth mask of concern and confusion he had worn so many times before. "Sophie, what are you talking about?" he said, his voice perfectly measured. "Are you feeling all right?" "I'm feeling better than I have in years," I replied. I opened the folder and spread the documents across the coffee table between us. Photographs of him with Vanessa, bank statements showing the unauthorized transfers, copies of the loans he had taken out in my name, property records for the flat in Chelsea, investment documents with my forged signature. Daniel stared at the papers, and I watched as the color drained from his face. He opened his mouth to speak, but no words came out. For the first time in our entire relationship, he had nothing to say. "I know everything," I continued. "I've known for months, and I've spent that time making sure you can't wriggle out of this. My solicitor has copies of all these documents, as does a forensic accountant, as does a journalist who's very interested in writing about Meridian Solutions and its creative approach to financial reporting." "Sophie," he started, his voice cracking. "Don't," I said. "Don't try to explain. Don't try to apologize, and definitely don't try to gaslight me again. Those days are over." He recovered faster than I expected. The fear in his eyes hardened into something else, something calculating and cold. It was the first time I had seen the real Daniel, the one who had been hiding behind the charming facade all along. "You don't know what you're doing," he said. "If you go public with any of this, you'll destroy yourself too. Your name is on those documents, your signature. How do you think that will look?" "My signature was forged," I replied, "and I have expert analysis to prove it. I also have records showing that I had no access to the accounts where the money was moved, no knowledge of the loans, no involvement in any of the fraudulent activity. I was very careful about that." He leaned forward, his jaw tight. "What do you want?" "I want a divorce. I want my name removed from all the debts you incurred fraudulently. I want half of the marital assets that actually exist, not the fictional numbers you've been showing me. And I want a signed statement admitting what you did." Daniel laughed, a harsh, bitter sound. "You're delusional if you think I'm going to sign anything." I smiled. "That's what I thought you'd say, which is why I also have evidence of your investor fraud, the fake clients, the fabricated revenue, the money you've been siphoning from people who trusted you. I imagine the Financial Conduct Authority would be very interested in seeing this material. So would your investors, so would the police." The mask slipped further. For the first time, I saw real fear in his eyes. "You wouldn't," he said. "Try me." We stared at each other for a long moment, the silence thick with tension. Then Daniel stood up abruptly, his wine glass tipping over and spilling red across the white carpet. He didn't seem to notice. "You've made a mistake, Sophie," he said, his voice low and dangerous. "You have no idea who you're dealing with." "Actually," I replied, standing to face him, "I know exactly who I'm dealing with. And for the first time in our entire relationship, So do you. He left the flat that night, packed a bag, got in his car, and disappeared without another word. I found out later that he went straight to Vanessa's place, which was exactly what I had expected. I had already alerted my solicitor that the confrontation had happened, and she had set the next phase of the plan in motion. The following Monday, Daniel received formal divorce papers. At the same time, I filed a report with the police documenting the identity theft and fraud he had committed using my personal information. Francis had carefully prepared the complaint to establish me as a victim rather than a participant, and the evidence I had gathered supported that narrative completely. But I wasn't finished. I had promised Daniel consequences, and I intended to deliver. The first domino fell 2 weeks later. An anonymous tip to a financial journalist led to a devastating exposé on Meridian Solutions. The article, published in a major business publication, detailed the company's fraudulent practices, the fake clients, the misrepresented earnings, the investor money that had disappeared into offshore accounts. Daniel was named as the architect of the scheme, his photograph accompanying the story. The reaction was immediate and catastrophic. Investors demanded their money back. Business partners severed ties. The company's board, which had been kept in the dark about the true state of affairs, called an emergency meeting and voted to terminate Daniel's position as CEO. Within days, Meridian Solutions was in freefall, heading toward bankruptcy and regulatory investigation. Daniel tried to fight back. He hired expensive lawyers, issued statements denying the allegations, threatened to sue everyone involved in making the accusations public. But the evidence was overwhelming, and more kept emerging as former employees came forward with their own stories of deception and manipulation. The second domino fell a month later, when the Financial Conduct Authority announced a formal investigation into Daniel Carter and Meridian Solutions. The investigation would eventually uncover the full extent of his fraud, leading to criminal charges that would take years to resolve. But even before any verdict was reached, Daniel's reputation was destroyed. He was unemployable, untouchable, a pariah in the industry he had once dominated. The third domino was personal. Vanessa, faced with the reality that Daniel was not the successful entrepreneur she had believed him to be, ended their relationship. The flat in Chelsea was repossessed when Daniel could no longer make the payments. The lifestyle he had promised her, the future he had dangled in front of her, evaporated like morning mist. I heard from Marcus that she moved back in with her parents in Manchester. I felt no satisfaction at her downfall. She had been a participant in Daniel's deception, yes, but she had also been one of his victims. He had lied to her just as he had lied to me, using her as a prop in the elaborate performance of his life. But I did feel satisfaction at Daniel's downfall. Deep, abiding satisfaction that grew with every new revelation, every new consequence, every new piece of his carefully constructed world that crumbled into dust. The divorce was finalized in the spring of 2023. Thanks to Francis's meticulous work and the overwhelming evidence of Daniel's fraud, I was able to extricate myself from the debts he had incurred in my name. The loans were invalidated, the credit cards were canceled, my name was cleared, my credit score slowly restored, my professional reputation intact. The marital assets were divided according to what actually existed rather than what Daniel had claimed. The flat in Battersea was sold, and I received my rightful share of the proceeds. The hidden money in offshore accounts was harder to recover, but the ongoing investigation was tracing those funds, and there was a possibility that some of it would eventually be returned to Daniel's victims. I moved into a small but comfortable flat in Dulwich, surrounded by trees and parks and neighbors who knew nothing about my past. I adopted a cat, a gray tabby named Luna, who kept me company on the long evenings when I was still processing everything that had happened. I reconnected with old friends I had neglected during my marriage, including Bex, who had never trusted Daniel and who welcomed me back with fierce, loyal love. My father, Henry, came to visit me in my new flat a few weeks after I moved in. He had been devastated when I told him the truth about my marriage, blaming himself for not seeing through Daniel's charm, for not protecting his daughter from a predator in disguise. I assured him that none of it was his fault, that Daniel had fooled everyone, that the only person responsible for Daniel's actions was Daniel himself. We sat together in my small living room, drinking tea and watching the sunset paint the sky orange and pink through my window. My father reached over and took my hand. "I'm proud of you," he said. "You could have let him destroy you. Instead, you destroyed him." I shook my head. "I didn't destroy him. He destroyed himself. I just made sure everyone could see the truth." "That's the same thing," he replied, squeezing my hand. And it took incredible courage. I thought about his words long after he had gone home. Courage. I wasn't sure if that was the right word for what I had done. Survival, maybe. Necessity. The refusal to be erased by a man who had never seen me as anything more than a tool for his own advancement. But there was something else too, something I was only beginning to understand. In the process of dismantling Daniel's lies, I had also dismantled the lies I had told myself. The belief that I needed someone else to complete me, the fear that I wasn't strong enough to face the world alone, the assumption that love meant sacrifice, meant silence, meant accepting whatever scraps of affection someone chose to throw my way. Daniel had tried to break me. Instead, he had set me free. The criminal trial took place in the autumn of 2024. Daniel faced multiple charges, including fraud, forgery, and conspiracy to commit financial crimes. The prosecution presented overwhelming evidence, including the documents I had gathered, the testimony of former investors, and the forensic accounting analysis that had traced the money he had stolen. Daniel maintained his innocence throughout the trial. He claimed that he had been a victim of circumstance, that the problems with Meridian Solutions were the result of market conditions and the actions of others, that his ex-wife had fabricated evidence to destroy him out of spite. His expensive lawyers mounted a vigorous defense, attacking the credibility of witnesses and attempting to cast doubt on the prosecution's timeline. But the evidence was too strong. The jury deliberated for 3 days before returning a verdict of guilty on all counts. Daniel stood in the dock, his face pale and drawn, as the judge pronounced sentence: 5 years in prison to be served at a medium security facility, a ban from serving as a company director for 15 years, an order to pay restitution to his victims, though the amount would likely never be fully recovered. I was in the courtroom when the verdict was read. I had debated whether to attend, worried that seeing Daniel would reopen wounds that were still healing, but I needed to be there. I needed to witness the moment when justice was finally served. Daniel looked at me as they led him away. His expression was a mixture of hatred and disbelief, as though he still couldn't accept that someone like me had brought down someone like him. I held his gaze steadily, refusing to look away, refusing to give him the satisfaction of seeing me flinch. And then he was gone, escorted through a side door by prison officers, and I was left standing in the empty courtroom, feeling lighter than I had in years. Bex took me out for dinner that night to celebrate what she called the victory of the century. We went to a fancy restaurant in Mayfair, ordered champagne and seafood and desserts we didn't need, and laughed and cried and talked until the staff started putting chairs on tables around us. "How do you feel?" Bex asked as we walked out into the cool night air. I thought about the question carefully. "Free," I said finally. "I feel free." She linked her arm through mine. "Good. Now the real work begins." "What do you mean?" "Building the life you actually deserve, the one he tried to take from you." I smiled, feeling the truth of her words settle into my chest. She was right. The revenge was complete. The truth had been exposed. Daniel was facing the consequences of his actions, but the story wasn't over. It was just beginning. Part 2. The months after Daniel's conviction were a strange mixture of relief and uncertainty. I had spent so long focused on the battle, on gathering evidence and building my case and preparing for the confrontation, that I wasn't quite sure what to do with myself when it was over. The enemy had been defeated, the war had been won, but the battlefield of my life was still littered with debris that needed to be cleared. I threw myself into work, which had always been a source of stability for me. My employers had been understanding throughout the divorce and the trial, allowing me the flexibility I needed to attend court dates and meetings with my solicitor. Now I repaid their kindness with renewed dedication, taking on challenging projects, mentoring junior colleagues, rebuilding my professional reputation with every successful audit and every satisfied client. The financial recovery was slower. Despite the court orders for restitution, Daniel had hidden his assets too well for much of the money to be recovered. The offshore accounts remained frozen but contested, tied up in international legal wrangles that could take years to resolve. The debts that had been incurred in my name were cleared, but the time and stress of dealing with creditors and credit agencies had left its mark. I learned to live frugally, to appreciate the simple things, to find joy in small moments rather than expensive experiences. My flat in Dulwich became a sanctuary, decorated with things I loved, filled with books and plants, in the presence of Luna, who had a habit of sitting on my chest in the mornings and demanding attention with persistent meows. Bex continued to be my anchor. She had always been protective of me, even when we were children growing up in the same London neighborhood. But the events of the past few years had deepened our bond into something unbreakable. She was the first person I called when I had news, good or bad. She was the one who showed up with wine and takeaway when I was having a difficult day. She was the one who reminded me, again and again, that I was stronger than I believed. About 6 months after the trial, Bex suggested that I might benefit from therapy. Not because there's anything wrong with you, she clarified quickly, but because you've been through something traumatic and you deserve support from someone who's trained to help with that. I had resisted the idea initially. I was fine, I insisted. I was handling it. I didn't need to sit on a couch and talk about my feelings to a stranger. But eventually, I gave in, mostly to get Bex to stop asking, and I made an appointment with a counselor named Dr. Priya Sharma. I expected to feel awkward and exposed during our sessions. Instead, I felt relieved. Dr. Sharma was warm and perceptive, asking questions that helped me see my experiences in new ways, validating emotions I had been suppressing for years, giving me tools to process the anger and grief and confusion that still lingered beneath the surface. We talked about the gaslighting, how Daniel had systematically undermined my perception of reality until I no longer trusted my own instincts. We talked about the way I had minimized the warning signs, the cultural and personal pressures that had made me believe I should stay in a marriage that was making me miserable. We talked about the difference between forgiveness and acceptance, about how moving forward didn't mean forgetting what had happened. What Daniel did was not your fault, Dr. Sharma told me during one of our sessions, but understanding why you stayed, why you explained away his behavior, can help you make different choices in the future. I nodded, feeling the truth of her words, even as they stung. I had been so determined not to be a victim that I had sometimes blamed myself for not seeing the signs sooner. But Dr. Sharma helped me understand that predators like Daniel were skilled at their craft, that they specifically targeted people who were trusting and loyal and good, because those qualities made them easier to exploit. You survived, she said. You recognized what was happening. You gathered evidence, you protected yourself, and you held him accountable. That takes extraordinary strength and resilience. I carried those words with me in the weeks that followed. Whenever I felt doubt creeping in, whenever I questioned my choices or worried about the future, I reminded myself of what I had accomplished. I had faced my worst fear, the person who had tried to destroy me, and I had won. The ripples of Daniel's downfall continued to spread. More victims came forward as news of his conviction made the rounds. Former business partners who had been defrauded, employees who had lost their jobs when the company collapsed. Even a woman in Bristol who claimed Daniel had promised to marry her while he was still married to me, stealing money from her savings before disappearing. I felt a complicated mixture of sympathy and anger on behalf of these people. They had been hurt by the same man who had hurt me, victims of the same charm and manipulation that I had fallen for. But I also felt a grim validation. Daniel's pattern of behavior had been consistent throughout his life. I was not special, not uniquely gullible. He had fooled everyone. The Bristol woman, whose name was Elizabeth, reached out to me through my solicitor. She wanted to meet, to talk about what had happened, to compare notes on the man who had damaged both of our lives. I was hesitant at first, unsure whether rehashing the past would help either of us heal, but eventually I agreed, and we met for coffee in a quiet cafe in the Cotswolds, halfway between our respective homes. Elizabeth was in her 50s, elegant and soft-spoken. with kind eyes that clouded with pain when she talked about Daniel. They had met at a conference 3 years before our wedding, when she was recently divorced and vulnerable to the attentions of a charming younger man. He had pursued her relentlessly, showering her with affection and promises, convincing her to invest in his company and his future. By the time she realized the truth, he had taken nearly £50,000 from her, money she had saved for her retirement, for her grandchildren's education, for security in her old age. She had been too ashamed to report him, too humiliated to tell anyone what had happened. It was only after his conviction that she found the courage to come forward. "I'm so sorry," I told her, reaching across the table to take her hand. "He's a monster. What he did to you, what he did to all of us, is unforgivable." Elizabeth shook her head. "You have nothing to apologize for. You're the one who stopped him. If it weren't for you, he would still be out there, doing this to other women." Her words stayed with me long after our meeting ended. I had never thought of my actions as heroic, never framed my revenge as anything more than personal survival. But Elizabeth's perspective helped me see it differently. By exposing Daniel, by holding him accountable, I had prevented him from hurting anyone else. The consequences I had orchestrated weren't just about punishment, they were about protection. Nearly 2 years after the trial, something unexpected happened. I received a letter from Margaret, Daniel's mother. We hadn't spoken since the divorce, and I wasn't sure what to expect when I saw the return address on the envelope. Part of me wanted to throw it away unread, but curiosity got the better of me, and I sat down at my kitchen table to read what she had written. The letter was long and heartfelt. Margaret apologized for not seeing what her son had become, for not warning me more clearly when I had the chance to walk away. She wrote about her own pain, the devastation of watching her child be exposed as a fraud and a criminal, the shame she felt when her friends and neighbors learned the truth. But she also thanked me. She thanked me for having the courage to do what she never could, to hold Daniel accountable for his actions rather than enabling them. She wrote that she had always known there was something wrong with him, some coldness at his core that she had tried to love away, but that her maternal instinct had prevented her from facing the truth. "I pray that you find peace and happiness," she concluded. "You deserved so much better than what my son gave you, and I will carry the guilt of that failure for the rest of my life." I cried when I finished reading the letter, not for Daniel, who deserved everything that had happened to him, but for Margaret, who was herself a victim of her son's pathology. She had loved him unconditionally, as mothers do, and he had used that love to shield himself from consequences, to convince everyone around him that he was normal and good and trustworthy. I wrote back to her a shorter letter that expressed my sympathy and forgiveness. I told her that she was not responsible for Daniel's choices, that he alone bore the burden of his actions, and that I hoped she would find her own path to healing. We continued to exchange letters over the following months, a tentative correspondence that helped both of us process our shared trauma. Margaret sent me photographs of Claire's children, Daniel's niece and nephew, who were growing up happy and healthy in the countryside. I sent her updates on my own life, the new opportunities opening up at work, the hobbies I was rediscovering, the cautious optimism I felt about the future. It was strange, maintaining a relationship with the mother of the man who had nearly destroyed me. But Margaret was not Daniel. She had been deceived and manipulated just as I had been, and her suffering was real. In some ways, our correspondence became a source of comfort for both of us, a reminder that good could emerge from even the darkest situations. The question of dating came up repeatedly, usually raised by well-meaning friends who thought I should put myself out there and find someone new. I resisted for a long time. The idea of trusting another person, of opening myself up to vulnerability and potential betrayal, filled me with a cold dread that I couldn't quite shake. But therapy helped. Time helped. And gradually, I began to believe that not everyone was like Daniel, that there were good people in the world, honest people, people who would treat me with the respect and love I deserved. I went on my first date 3 years after the divorce was finalized. His name was James, a secondary school teacher I had met through a mutual friend. He was nothing like Daniel, quiet where Daniel had been loud, sincere where Daniel had been performative, comfortable in his own skin rather than constantly seeking validation and admiration. Our first date was a walk through Dulwich Park on a crisp autumn afternoon. We talked about our lives, our interests, our hopes for the future. I told him a little about my past, enough for him to understand that I had been through something difficult, without overwhelming him with details. He listened without judgment, asked thoughtful questions, and didn't press for more information than I was ready to share. At the end of the walk, he thanked me for meeting him and asked if I would like to do it again. I said yes. The relationship progressed slowly, which was exactly what I needed. James was patient and understanding, never pushing me to move faster than I was comfortable with, always checking in to make sure I was okay. He met Bex and earned her grudging approval. He met my father and charmed him with his knowledge of cricket and his genuine interest in Henry's stories about the old days in banking. And slowly, carefully, I began to trust again. I won't pretend it was easy. There were moments when my anxiety spiked, when I searched for warning signs that weren't there, when I questioned whether James was really who he claimed to be. But Dr. Sharma helped me distinguish between reasonable caution and trauma-induced paranoia. And James himself showed me, through consistent actions over time, that he was worthy of my trust. We moved in together 2 years after our first date, a small house in Crystal Palace with a garden for Luna to explore and enough space for both of us to have our own corners. James filled the house with books and music and the smell of his cooking. I filled it with plants and artwork and the feeling of finally being home. The wedding took place on a perfect June afternoon in a garden overlooking the English Channel. It was a small ceremony, just close friends and family, nothing like the elaborate production of my first marriage. My father walked me down the aisle again, his eyes bright with tears of joy rather than worry. Bex stood beside me as my maid of honor, her smile wide enough to light up the entire venue. And when James looked at me and promised to love me, I knew he meant every word. I think about Daniel sometimes, not often, and not with the raw pain that used to accompany his memory, but with a kind of distant curiosity about what became of him. He served 3 years of his 5-year sentence before being released on good behavior. According to Margaret's letters, he moved to a small town in Scotland, trying to rebuild his life away from the people who knew what he had done. I hope he's changed. I hope he's learned something from what happened, from the consequences he faced, from the lives he damaged. But honestly, I doubt it. People like Daniel rarely change. They adapt, they modify their tactics, they find new victims to exploit. The best you can hope for is that they're contained, that their ability to cause harm is limited by the exposure of their true nature. But that's not my concern anymore. My revenge is complete. The truth was exposed, the consequences were delivered, and I emerged from the wreckage stronger than before. Daniel tried to destroy me, and instead, I destroyed the illusion he had created around himself. I showed the world who he really was, and now I get to live the life he tried to take from me. When I look back on everything that happened, I see it as a journey. Not the journey I planned, not the journey I wanted, but a journey that taught me things I never would have learned otherwise. I learned that I am stronger than I believed. I learned that the people who truly love me will stand by me through the worst of times. I learned that justice, while imperfect, is possible if you're willing to fight for it. And I learned that revenge, when it's executed with patience and precision, can be the most satisfying thing in the world. I don't regret what I did. I don't feel guilty for exposing Daniel's lies, for contributing to his conviction, for watching his empire crumble into dust. He made his choices, and he faced the consequences of those choices. That's not vengeance, that's accountability. My therapist once asked me if I thought I had achieved closure. I considered the question carefully before answering. I don't know if closure is something you ever fully achieve, I said. The experience changed me. It will always be part of my story, but I'm not defined by it anymore. I'm defined by what I built afterward. She nodded, and I could see the approval in her eyes. That sounds like growth, she said. It is. It's growth born of pain, of betrayal, of the darkest period of my life, but it's growth nonetheless. And I would rather be the person I am now, scarred and cautious, but infinitely wiser than the person I was before Daniel revealed his true nature. Last month, I celebrated my 40th birthday with a party in our garden. James organized the whole thing, filling the space with fairy lights and flowers and all the people who matter most to me. My father made a speech that brought tears to my eyes. Bex gave me a gift that made me laugh until I couldn't breathe. Luna supervised the proceedings from her favorite spot on the fence, occasionally meowing her disapproval at the noise. As I looked around at the faces of the people I loved, as I felt James's arm around my waist and watched the sunset paint the sky in shades of gold and rose, I realized something important. This was the life I was supposed to have, not the life Daniel had promised me, built on lies and exploitation and the constant erosion of my self-worth, but this real, imperfect, beautiful life, built on the ashes of everything he had destroyed. I won. Not because I got revenge, though the revenge was deeply satisfying. Not because Daniel was punished, though he certainly deserved everything that happened to him, but because I refused to let him define me. I refuse to be his victim, his casualty, his cautionary tale. I am the hero of my own story, and my story is just getting started. Sometimes at night, when the house is quiet and James is sleeping beside me, I think about the woman I used to be. The trusting, hopeful woman who fell in love with a charming stranger in a converted warehouse in Shoreditch. The woman who believed every lie, explained away every warning sign, sacrificed her own instincts on the altar of someone else's manipulation. I don't blame her. I feel compassion for her. She did the best she could with the information she had. She loved fully and trusted completely, and when that love and trust were betrayed, she found the strength to fight back. She survived, and she taught me everything I know about resilience. If you're listening to this story and recognizing patterns from your own life, if you're trapped in a relationship that's slowly destroying you, if you're questioning your own reality because someone has worked to undermine your confidence, I want you to know something. You are not crazy, you are not overreacting, and you are not alone. The truth is a powerful weapon. Gather your evidence, protect yourself legally, build a support network of people who believe you. And when the time is right, expose the lies for what they are. You deserve better. You deserve honesty and respect and love that doesn't require you to diminish yourself. You deserve a partner who builds you up rather than tearing you down. And you deserve revenge, not violent revenge, not destructive revenge, but the quiet, devastating revenge of living well, of thriving, of becoming everything your abuser tried to prevent you from being. That's what I did. And if I can do it, so can you. My name is Sophie Mitchell. I was married to a man who betrayed me in every possible way. He stole my money, my trust, my sense of self. He tried to leave me bankrupt and broken, a casualty of his ambition and greed. But I fought back. I gathered evidence. I exposed the truth. I watched him face the consequences of his actions, and then I built a life more beautiful than anything he could have imagined for me. My ex turned into my enemy, and I made sure he lost. The end is also the beginning. That's what I've learned from this journey. Every ending creates space for something new. Daniel's betrayal was the end of my innocence, the end of my blind trust, the end of the life I thought I was living. But it was also the beginning of my strength, my self-knowledge, my ability to recognize my own worth. I'm grateful for that, strange as it sounds. I'm grateful for the lessons, even though they came wrapped in pain. I'm grateful for the clarity that emerged from the chaos, the friendships that deepened through the struggle, the love that found me when I had almost given up on finding it. And I'm grateful for the story itself, the story of betrayal and revenge, of lies and truth, of an enemy vanquished and a life reclaimed. It's not an easy story to tell, but it's my story, and I'm proud of every chapter. If Daniel ever hears this, I want him to know something. He didn't win. He will never win. Because winning isn't about money or status or power over others. It's about living authentically, loving fully, and treating people with the respect they deserve. He failed at all of those things, and I succeeded. That's the real revenge. Not the criminal conviction, though that was satisfying. Not the financial consequences, though those were deserved. Not even the public exposure, though that was necessary. The real revenge is happiness. The real revenge is peace. The real revenge is sitting in my garden on a summer evening, surrounded by the people I love, knowing that I survived the worst thing that ever happened to me and came out stronger on the other side. Daniel tried to take everything from me. Instead, he taught me what really matters. And for that, in the strangest way, I'm almost grateful. Almost. The truth has been revealed. The consequences have been delivered. The enemy has been defeated. And I am finally, completely, irrevocably free.